Please welcome Marty Wilson Taylor, President and CEO of the YWCA Boston.
Good evening. Can you hear me? Talk to me. Good evening and welcome. Tonight's forum is one that we've all looked forward to for a long time. And when I get my script ready, I can tell you where I'm going from here. Okay. Give me a moment. I'm very pleased to welcome you tonight to our third and final public forum in a series of civic dialogues. And I want to thank all of you for being a part of this momentous occasion. In January 2000, the YWCA Boston assembled the Academy of Women Achievers for a leadership reunion. Each AWA member had been recognized for her leadership role in her work and in her community. And now we were asking them to do something more, to help us work collectively to reclaim our advocacy role. And at that time, the Social Change Initiative was born. And the first part of the initiative, the Public Forum Series, was launched. As most of you know, the YWCA Boston has been serving women and families for more than a century. We made a commitment to concretely resume our advocacy role for the 21st century in keeping with our 2000 strategic plan. To us, all of this makes sense, given the times in which we're living, and since historically this has been a component of our work. Before I introduce you to the program, though, I want to make sure that you don't leave here asking, what is the YWCA? Because I hear that a lot. I hear people say, I know the YWCA, but I don't know what you do. So I don't want you to leave here without understanding who we are, what we stand for, and how you can be a part of what we do. Our mission embodies the ideals of a democratic future, where gender equity and racial justice become community norms, and where there's justice and dignity for everyone in Boston. Each day we touch the lives of many people, both young and old, people in need of support and services, and people who want to be a part of making Boston stronger through making people have a life that's safer, healthier, and better educated and empowered. We serve grandparents, raising their grandchildren at our Generations Learning Together program in Dorchester, teenage mothers who are homeless, struggling to stay in school or find a job, women who need a safe, supportive home and community at our Berkeley residence in the South End, and urban youth who yearn for critical thinking and confidence skills in a safe and neutral environment in our Youth Voice Collaborative. And then there are women of color who are underinsured or uninsured, and we help them with finding early detection and prevention services for breast cancer and cervical cancer in our Encore Plus program. The programs and the services that we offer emerge as the community needs evolve. This brings me to our 21st century initiatives. There are two. The Social Change Initiative and our 140 Clarendon Street renovation project. Remaining true to our core competency of providing affordable and safe housing, the Clarendon Street project addresses critical housing needs in Boston, and when complete, we will add an additional 132 housing units in the center of the city, bringing the YWCA to providing a total of 440 units of housing in Boston, and I know and you know that we need it. And then there is our Social Change Initiative, which all of you have been a part of, and it is a recommitment to our advocacy role. Tonight's public forum, the education of Black and historic youth, marks the third in our series that addressed other critical issues such as environmental health and economic opportunity. The enthusiasm and commitment to change and energy that has been demonstrated by all of you particularly who were participating in the forum, is a keen reminder of our work and that it is not finished and that we will finish it together. And if we do, we can make Boston a more vibrant, integrated, dynamic city where equity and justice prevails. Our public forum series could not have been possible without the generous financial support of our Academy of Women Achievers, the Boston Foundation, Citizens Bank, Liberty Mutual Group, and Mellon New England. Additionally, we have many community partners who made these civic dialogues as engaging, informative, and diverse as possible. And they include the Boston Women's Commission, Fort Hall Forum, Harvard School of Public Health, the University UMass Center of Women in Politics and Public Policy, the Women's Educational and Industrial Union, and the WGBH Education Foundation. We've had the support of the entire community, and for that I'd like to say thank all of you and thank all of our supporters, our partners, our colleagues, and our donors. Now it's time for the real work to begin.
Good evening, I'm Callie Crossley, and I'll be your moderator for this, our third in the series of Civic Dialogues. Tonight, claiming the future of the education of Black and Hispanic youth in high school beyond the MCAS. I am emphasizing beyond because we're not talking about the MCAS. We're talking about beyond the MCAS. Just want to make that clear at the beginning. Okay. It's my distinct pleasure tonight to introduce our two guest speakers. The first is Mary Purifoy, who is the president of the Public Education Network. Based in Washington, D.C., PEN is an association of local education funds advancing school reform in low-income communities. Now, before she went off to head PEN, Wendy lived here in Boston, and she was executive vice president and chief operating officer of the Boston Foundation, a community foundation that supports educational programs. The Public Education Network is one of the nation's leading agencies focused on systemic school reform. Ms. Purifoy travels the country speaking about the relationship between school quality and the quality of community and public life. Our other guest tonight is Pedro Noguero, the Judith K. Diamond Professor in Community and Schools at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. Before coming to Harvard, he was director of the Institute for the Study of Social Change at the University of California at Berkeley. Professor Noguero's work focuses on urban schools' responses to social and economic forces. He is collaborating with several large urban school districts in this work. He has published widely. Of note for this audience is his 2001 paper, Racial Politics and the Elusive Quest for Excellence and Equity in Education, and his soon-to-be published paper, Confronting the Urban, How City Schools Can Respond to the Forces of Social Inequality. Professor. As you came in this evening, you may have noticed that there were points up on the screen. They're also in your folders. These are key points that both of our speakers think really underscore their purpose and focus in discussing both systemic school reform and then some of the successes in urban schools. So I want you to pay attention to that in your folders if you haven't paid attention to it, and it's also been up on the screen because we're going to be doing an exercise in just a few minutes. Since we know this is beyond the MCAS, this is going to be a refreshing conversation, and it's going to be taped by the WGBH Forum Network, just so that you know what's going on. And you'll be able to access that at the www.wgbh.org website after the forum is over. So, First, let me say that at your tables are some really well-trained and exciting dynamic facilitators who will lead you in this first brief exercise. And what they want you to do is to take that which you have learned from the key points, coupled with your own questions around this subject beyond the MCAS, and in your own groups, in which we're going to start in just a few minutes, begin to think about some of the common themes that we can address beyond the MCAS, and come away with one or two questions from each table. We're going to go until my timekeeper says, which I think is about 15 minutes, and after that I'll collect the answers and then we're sending them to our speakers. So, begin. Back together. Don't worry, you'll get another chance. This was just to get your thoughts flowing. Coming back together. If you have not turned in your questions, please raise your hand so the runners can come. I need to get your attention. You've seen the questions on screen, the key points from our presenters tonight, and now you have a moment, all of you, to hear from them as they amplify those key points and let you know what is the context for those key points. First to speak, Professor Noguero.
Good evening. Can you hear me? Okay, I'll try to make sure I speak into the mic. I've been spending the last several days at schools here in the area. Today I was at 2 schools. And the thing that strikes me most when I come back and I reflect upon what I see is the fact that schools are a lot like marriages, in that in some marriages it's possible over time for people to forget why they got married. Right? That is, they can live together, they can raise a family, kiss each other good morning and good night, but lose all sense of the purpose of the marriage, what brought them together in the first place. Schools are a lot like that. Right? I go to schools that operate almost like machines. Adults show up, kids show up, bells ring, there's the semblance of activity, but very often when you ask people about what they're doing and why, there is a disconnect between what we think the purpose of school should be and what's actually happening. And part of what I think we have to do is, just as we need to do this in marriages and relationships, is to remind ourselves of what this is all about. Right? That is, what is the purpose of school? Why do we require our children to go there? In many schools, there is a lack of deliberateness and purposefulness about the work that teachers do, about the work that students do, and we fall into the routine of school. And the routine of school, like the routine of marriage, is not the same as being in touch with the purpose of it. We have spent the last year working with students at 10 high schools in this area. And we've been trying to understand what schools are doing through the experience of the students. Right? So these schools are going through various reforms aimed at trying to improve themselves. And instead of asking the adults what they're doing, we decide, let's ask the kids what they're experiencing. Right? That is, it's schools that say they're going small, and for the purpose of creating a more personal and intimate environment. Is that what kids really feel? For schools that have adopted new curriculum for the purpose of raising standards and pushing kids harder and engaging them more deeply, is that what the kids experience? And over again, what we find is a tremendous gap. A gap between what the adults think they're doing and what the kids are actually experiencing. When we speak back to the adults about what we learn from the kids, that's when we get the most telling response about whether or not the adults are serious in what they're doing. Right? At some schools, there is great attention to wanting to know, to wanting to understand how the kids feel, how they perceive what's happening. At one school, we told them that there was a student who was passed the MCAS with a 4 in the 10th grade and told us at the end of that year that he was going to drop out because the school was boring. And we told this to the administration when we met with them, and they said, wow, what a shame. Next. At another school, we told teachers, the kids are telling us that there are low expectations for them at this school. They're not being challenged. They're not being educated. Principal nodded his head and said, yes. He said, I wish we could deal with that, but we're really focused on MCAS right now. The disconnect between what the kids experience and what the adults think they're doing is striking. We talk a lot about the achievement gap. I would say that the bigger gap is the gap in the relationship, the lack of relationship, the lack of connection between adult and student, and the lack of connection to purpose. There's a lot of talk in policy circles about increasing accountability. And I think accountability is a good thing. But we have decided to hold those who are most vulnerable and those who have least control over their education accountable. Meanwhile, no adult is accountable. We were asked not to talk about MCAS. And I think this is true whether it's MCAS on the agenda or whatever the agenda is. That is, unless there's a sense of mutual accountability, unless teachers and parents and students and administrators and policymakers and the community feel a sense of accountability for what we provide to children, we will continue to see and to treat public education and its improvement in this country as this elusive goal that is as unattainable, at the moment at least, as the cure for cancer or the effort to save the ozone. The shame of this country is that we are a great country with great resources, great technology. We know how to do this because we do it in areas where there are affluent kids all the time. The shame and disgrace of this country is we don't care enough to do it for all kids. And even after MCAS, that's still going to be the question before us. Right now, we pretend that we can improve schools by humiliating them, right? By ranking them in the paper, by firing the superintendent or a principal, as if that by itself would actually enable schools to improve. It's really not that hard. It shouldn't be that difficult to ensure that we provide all children with access to smart, caring adults who know how to teach them. It shouldn't be that hard. The challenge we face as a community is to generate the will, the commitment to make it happen. I came to Boston 3 years ago, and I said, it's amazing to me. Boston has more universities per capita than any city in the world. Why don't we have better schools? It would seem that knowledge would just filter in through the windows by diffusion. That just by being here, you should get smarter. But that's another gap, right, between the knowledge production that goes on here and what actually happens in our school. We've got to stop accepting the fact that these schools operate and run like machines and start asking ourselves, do they actually achieve the purpose? Do they actually fulfill our expectations? Would they actually be good enough for those of us who have the ability to choose not to send our kids there? Because it's when they're that good that we'll know they're good for all the kids.
2 more minutes.
Well, let me also say this, that when we see these rankings of schools, when they come out, none of us is typically surprised to know which schools and which district's going to be on the bottom, right? Because it's a little bit like racial profiling. If you know the race and socioeconomic makeup of the district, you can pretty much predict where they're going to end up on this scale, this ladder. Which makes it the question, why are we doing it then, if we knew already where they'd be? The real question is, what do we do to improve those schools? How do we muster the will, and how do we change the habits? And changing the habits is the key. Before I came in this afternoon, I was in a conversation with a group of teachers about what was happening in their school, and we set it up as a fishbowl for the teachers to talk about their work, about what was working in their school, what was not working in their school. And the administrators were listening. And someone pointed out to me afterwards that while those teachers were talking in what I thought was a profound conversation about their work, administrators were filling out paperwork and were not clearly, many of them, attentive or engaged or listening even to what these teachers were saying. How could it be? How could it be that we would miss out or not recognize the importance of engaging our teachers more fully in the work that they do? I see the same thing with our students. Students who are there in mind, or there in body but not in mind in the schools, who haven't begun to be tapped in terms of their imagination, their creativity. Kids who demonstrate incredible skill and ability outside of school, who come to school and appear to be completely deficient and are seen and treated that way.
Thank you, Professor.
We can do better. And there are models out there that show us that it can be done.
Ms. Purifoy?
Well, I can't begin my remarks. Can you hear me? Without saying how great it is to be back in Boston. I lived in Boston for 25 years. I now live in Washington, D.C., and it's nice to be in a place where the seasons change. So I'm glad to be back. I want to say that I agree with everything that Pedro has said, and I'll focus in on a couple of things. One is, I think we have an opportunity now that we have not had before, which is to increase the achievement of children at all levels. And we have a framework for this. Many people have their issues with this framework, but it's really standards-based reform. And essentially what standards-based reform has said is that we have to set goals about what children ought to know and be able to do. We make those goals public, not just for the children, but for the accountability of the community when those goals are made public. We are saying that education is a public and a democratic act when you make it public. Secondly, we're saying that we have to have a fair set of assessments, multiple assessments, to know whether or not children are getting that information, and that we use the feedback from those assessments to tell us how we can keep on increasing achievement. What that constitutes is a learning environment. And so what we are now engaged in the country, clumsy though it may be, is this effort to make real the fact that all children can learn, this is the slogan, and learn at high levels. I think the standards-based reform movement never really acknowledged the civilization shift that this represents. because never before in human history have we said that human potential is fluid and not fixed. It's sort of like when Galileo went to the Pope and said, you know what, this constellation looks a little bit different than we thought it did. And the Pope said, you know what, we don't want to hear that. You go to jail. We're going to banish you. Well, that's part of the push-pull that's going on in society at the moment, which is we are saying for the first time in history that human potential is fluid and not fixed. And we are now turning to only one part of the equation to address that, and that's schools. The other part of the equation sits in the community. Let me talk for a moment about what we think, and Pedro talked a little bit about this, a lot about this, in schools. The whole issue of instructional strategies. What's going on for teachers? What is it that they're teaching? How are they teaching it? Are they looking at each other in reflective practice? Are they coming back together and talking about what methodology worked, whether it was in literacy or teaching math? Teaching is a collective act. It's a collaborative act. Right now, up until this point, teaching has been done in isolation. So teachers have not had the opportunity to form community with themselves or with their students. One of the things that is shifting in this movement to increase student achievement is to, in fact, look at the work of teachers in instruction and begin to break it down. Achievement is about the relationship between the teacher and the student and the capacity to get across the material that the student needs to learn, wants to learn, and that the teacher wants to convey. Well, that's a very complex set of relationships, and what is going on in Boston and some other school districts around the country is that they are really creating learning communities that, in fact, Pedro and I would both want to see. Communities of reflective practice. And as a result of that, when reflective practice is going on, when you can walk into a classroom and the teacher can say very clearly what they're doing, when the student can say very clearly what's going on, in fact, achievement does start to increase. But the other thing that happens in reflective practice communities is that those communities are not just isolated in schools. The community knows what good teaching practice is. And they begin to take the practices and policies of good teaching, good instruction, and they begin to translate that into who sits on the school board, who becomes superintendent, what the dollars look like for professional development, and the resources that will be available to schools. I was looking at this video, as all of you were, the clash of the music, the buildings that kids were going into every day. Most of us in this room do not go into facilities that look like that. We go into facilities that are well-equipped. We go into facilities that are clean. We go into facilities that are 21st century facilities. But we send our children off to school every day in facilities that we would not like to go into and work every day. And when it comes time to come to communities to increase the bond so that we can have the types of facilities that can be true learning environments, the public turns it down. Now, you can't have the kinds of schools that you want if you're not willing to understand what it takes to get quality education and then act upon it. So one of the principles that I want to say is the public has the type of education it says it wants. And you need to look around and say, is this really the type of education I want? Because there are plenty of opportunities for the public to engage and change that. The second part is that I would remind us that creating learning environments in schools that are clear about what students need to know and be able to do, have a fair set of assessments, and use those assessments not in a punitive fashion for either the adults or the students, but provide an opportunity for feedback so that children can, in fact, increase performance, is very important. It also doesn't just happen in schools. Many communities are looking at quality preschool programs so that children are coming to school ready to learn, so that they are coming to school with social skills. They're coming to schools recognizing colors and letters, and part of that has to do with the value that the community places on learning. The other part has to do with children having structured learning environments after school. Many kids go off to the boys' clubs and the girls' clubs and the YWCA and lots of other sorts of activities. But there isn't always a link between those activities and what's going on in school. And I'm not suggesting that after school and social service agencies should be running school programs, but they should be running the kinds of programs that are structured and help children to learn about their capacities and their competencies and to build their sense of confidence. What we do in that is that we create a continuous learning community. There's one of the things that Jesse Jackson once said is that we send our children off to school like dirty laundry, and we expect them to come home neat, clean, bleached, and pressed. And we just expect to pick it up. And part of what is going on in our schools at the moment is that we have a public that has divorced itself from its responsibility for quality public education. We don't provide the resources to teachers that they need to teach. We don't provide the salaries to teachers. And so you end up with the type of environment that Pedro talked about. Nobody wants to be there because everybody knows that they're not being supported in that environment. So how do we break this cycle? How do we say, really fulfill what is in standards and what we all want to happen in saying that human potential is fluid and not fixed? What are the sets of things that we are going to do in our communities and in our schools with a resource base that is going to enable the kind of quality education we want to have happen for our children?
2 minutes.
That's it. Thank you.
Got a lot of good questions and themes from the audience, but of course I'm the moderator, so I get the first one. On both of your key points, you have accountability as a major theme or a key point. But when accountability is applied to low-income communities or urban schools, it often comes across, I think, sounding like either a dirty word or a weapon. And I'm wondering if you could just respond to that and speak about how accountability really is a positive thing or should be working as a positive thing when you talk about the education of Black and Latino high school youth.
Well, let's start by thinking about how accountability works in middle-class and affluent communities. In those communities, schools feel directly accountable to the people they serve, right? Because they serve parents who feel entitled to demand the very best for their children. And if they don't get the very best, someone's going to hear about it because they feel entitled. The school board, the superintendent, lawyers, whatever it takes, by any means necessary, my child will get a good education. In low-income areas, schools do not feel accountable to the people they serve. In fact, they're more likely to feel that those they serve are lucky to have a chance to send their kids there. I was at a school. On the receptionist's desk is a sign that says, "This is not Burger King. We do things my way here." Okay. Now, it was a joke, but what a greeting. Tells you all you need to know about that school. To change, so accountability is important, but accountability in urban districts is from the school site to the superintendent to the board or to the committee, not from the school to those served. And I would say any school that believes it can treat those they serve as though they, without respect, is a school that will never improve. Never. Because if you believe that those you serve have no option but to take whatever you give them, then where does the incentive come to treat them well?
I agree with what Pedro said, and let me add this. I think accountability is a contract, and it has an agreement in it. It's a two-part contract. It may even be a 3- or 4-part contract. But certainly in the learning environment, it's a 3-part contract. It's a contract between the principal, the teacher, and the child. And the clarity of that contract is what we have been working on in school reform. This child is in grade 2. They will learn how to read. They will learn how to think critically. They will learn how to do their numbers, whatever it is we say, and that's what constitutes the contract, what it is that's supposed to be the outcome. And then the sets of relationships work around that contract. What accountability is finding out whether or not it's working. And if it isn't working, having some recourse to make a change to make it work. So one of the things that I think is really critically important in our shift in thinking about increasing achievement, particularly for Black and Hispanic children, is there's a contract that everybody comes into most poor schools with. Teachers come in with a contract like, if I do the best I can, it's good enough. The kids come in with a contract, if I do the best I can, it may be good enough. And you have communities that are operating at such a deficit that, in fact, parents begin to look upon schools as safe places to have their kids housed, at least during a period of time in the day, because they know in those buildings, at least for a period of time, they like to believe that they'll be safe. So this issue of accountability is a much larger contract, getting clarity about what the contract is, how we hold adults accountable for keeping that contract, and then how we look at the contract between the school and the community around the school. And we won't get those changes. So I think that we can, we see the end point of it. Kids are being held accountable for things that they shouldn't be held accountable for. But at some point, you've got to intervene in the cycle and say, if achievement's going to increase, we've got to be clear about how we're going to do it, and we've got to hold people accountable. I think adults should be held accountable first, but I do not think that there should be no accountability for children.
Well, you all in the audience may not be surprised to know that really your questions were very similar, and they fall into two large categories. And the first have to do with teachers. And I'm going to read a number of them because I think that for our speakers to get a clear sense about what everybody in the room is thinking about with regard to teachers. How can we get qualified teachers to stay in Boston? What can we do to attract better teachers in urban schools? How do schools create conditions that promote high levels of teaching and learning in circumstances where some teachers are not, quote unquote, on board with rising expectations? How do we retain the very best, in quotes, teachers who really believe in our children when educational policies don't seem to be informed by teachers' work or families' experiences in our school system? What mechanism will okay, I can't read this. Okay. How will or does consequences of success differ from, no, this is a totally different question. I'm sorry, I can't read it. All right, I'll go to the next one. It's all about teachers, though. How do we ensure that we can recruit capable teachers and retain them, address the economics, the licensing, the conditions? And how do we know if we are hiring the best teachers? How do you get better teachers? Is there something to help fill in the gaps on the part of teachers? What can the best models nationally for recruiting and retaining, what are the best models nationally for recruiting and retaining quality teachers, particularly those that are people of color and males? So you get a good sense there of what people are thinking about. I think they looked at both of your key points and honed right in on the critical piece, which is teachers. If you both could address these.
Well, it is the critical point. That is the point. and all the other points are secondary, right? That is, unless we can get good teachers in our schools working with our kids, not a lot is going to change. Okay? And we could spend a lot of time talking about what is a good teacher, because a good teacher is not simply someone who went to a good school and is smart, but is also able to connect with kids and demonstrate some creativity and skill in teaching them. money is a factor, clearly, right? It's a factor in every other aspect of our society. Why wouldn't it be a factor in education? When I was in California, I was fond of pointing out that the starting salary, this was in 1995, for a prison guard in California was $46,000 a year. I know a lot of people who would jump at a teaching job if you started them at $46,000 a year. I think teachers should get at least as much as prison guards. So if we believe that we are in a capitalist society, people believe money matters. We pay point guards well, we pay quarterbacks well, we pay CEOs real well. Why not teachers? So money matters, and I believe we would do major improvements simply by elevating the salary scale for teachers. But beyond that, what's the number one reason why teachers leave schools is not about money. It's about the conditions in the schools. Disorganized, dysfunctional schools, especially schools that take their newest teachers and assign them to the most difficult classes, which is consistently what most schools do. Right? It goes back to what I said. Why would schools do that? Take their least experienced people and assign them to the most challenging to teach children. Because it's not about serving those kids. It's about appeasing the adults. And guess what? The parents of the high-achieving kids won't let them assign an inexperienced or incompetent person to teach their kids because they will let them hear about it. So if we need to look at the conditions in schools and why it is that certain people that leave frequently, why do they leave? I was telling this to a school today. Let's do some exit interviews. Ask them when they leave, what happened? What could we have done differently to have made it possible for you to stay? Because a lot of times the conditions under which they work, the isolation that Wendy talked about already, the heaping on of extra responsibilities, the inability to get help and support when they need it. Because guess what? You don't learn to be a good teacher in graduate school. Most of what you learn on the job. Which means if you don't have the chance to learn from experienced veterans, to actually observe good teachers at work, where do you learn that? There are a lot of teachers who close the door and pray and hope for the best because they don't know what they're doing. So we need to make it more transparent. We need to provide a lot more support. We need to train teachers more like we train doctors. Right? We don't send recent medical school graduates and say, okay, go on, you're on your own now. Go cut those people open and cure diseases. We make sure they are under the supervision of a skilled physician for years before they get to touch a human being. But we take people straight off the street who have minimal qualifications and say, here you go, good luck. And we put them in some of the most difficult to work in schools. So the answer for why they don't stay is obvious. And again, if you look at the schools that are doing well, you find teachers, even without the pay, who are happy about their work because of the support they get, the camaraderie they have, the joy they derive from the teaching. Because most people don't go into teaching for the money. They go into it for the very best of reasons. They're concerned about kids. Okay? And in those kinds of schools, well, the interesting thing is people actually work harder. It's harder to be in a successful school than in a failing school because you're putting in more time, but you're putting in productive time, not the kind of time you put in at a failing school.
There's a lot of work going on across the country, and a lot of that work is going on right here in Boston. One is looking at the recruitment process. You know, lots of teachers, lots of people apply to be teachers, and they never hear back from their districts that they apply to. So having a recruitment process that's clear, that's responsive, that says to people, that responds back and says, here's the district, here's the stats. You know, anytime we apply for a job, we get a letter back saying we've received your resume. That doesn't always happen in school districts. So that's one piece, getting a recruitment process that is really just clear, transparent, aligned, responsive. The other is looking at that first class of teachers, as Pedro talked about, and looking at the induction process. What happens when a new teacher arrives? Are they in a buddy system with somebody? Are they in a school with an experienced principal? What's the mentorship strategy for new teachers? Who works with them at the end of the year? The kind of conversation that takes place between and among principals that are dealing with new teachers, and what are their strategies for helping those new teachers throughout the year. The thing that really keeps teachers is that students are learning, and so this strategy called creating communities of practice, where teachers are really looking at the work that they're trying to get their students to do. They are going in and out of each other's classrooms, critiquing one another, commenting, giving each other strategies, doing ongoing professional development in the course of the day in the school. Then there's professional development that can take place between the universities and other strategies. But some of the most important professional development that takes place for teachers takes place in the course of the school day, and it takes place in the school. And it is feedback from colleagues and support. So one of the things that I think we don't realize is that schools have been very isolated places. I can't tell you how many schools I visit, and I go in to use the telephone, and I think this must be from the Alexander Graham Bell Museum, because the equipment that is in schools. So teachers need up-to-date equipment. They need technology. And I would say in Boston is a really good place to take a look at some of this. The Boston Plan for Excellence and the superintendent here in Boston are really working on this whole issue of creating communities of practice. And it's a very important strategy, breaking down instruction, helping people to get better at it, helping people learn from one another. I think most of us think, oh, you just go into a classroom and you just start to teach. And it's not that. As Pedro said, you don't go into a hospital and just start to operate. And teaching turns out to be a far more complex set of things than any of us ever realized. Also, the Teacher's Day, one of the things that's also going on between the Boston Public Schools and the Boston Plan is really analyzing what goes on in a Teacher's Day that has nothing to do with instruction. And can we get them completely focused on instruction and get the rest of the stuff out of there so that they don't have to be working on the things that don't have anything to do with instruction. We get to go to our jobs and stay focused on our work. And if teachers had the opportunity to be at their jobs with the level of professional development, instructional feedback, and to be focused completely on their work, we would see our students achieve. And the principal is a very important instructional leader and coach for new teachers. So you need coaching strategies, you need feedback loops, communities of practice, and all of these strategies in schools that are succeeding with poor and disadvantaged children, they use all of these strategies.
There are two questions that are just hot on the minds of people right here listening to you two. One is, has Pedro seen firsthand the learning communities that Wendy described in Boston, and where in Boston? And second, how do we garner the will and commitment of the community or the district to sustain and support good models?
I have seen in Boston these learning communities that Wendy's described. I have. I was at a school today where I've seen it. It's a charter school. It's called the Academy Pacific Rim. I saw at that school kids engaged in high-level instruction, learning, fully participating, and what's more is reflected in their test scores. I truly believe that kids who are exposed to high-quality instruction don't need test prep, don't need to sweat about the MCAS, because they are getting an enriched education. Now, so yes, I've seen it. I've seen isolated examples of it in lots of other schools. And the disturbing thing there is, why don't we know how to replicate it in those other schools? Why don't we know how to build upon it in those other schools? Because in almost all of the schools, we can find teachers who are exceptional, who have made connection with their kids, who are creative and effective, but they're isolated, to go back to Wendy's point. So, yes, such schools exist. I can name others, but that's one that's fresh in mind because I was there today. It doesn't mean there isn't room for improvement there, right? And part of our meeting was about the areas where the improvement's needed. But yes, there's high-level learning community right there at that school.
How do you garner the will to support those models?
Say again?
How do you garner the will of the community or the district to support those models?
I think a lot of it comes from supporting the teachers who do the work, ensuring that they have the tools, the support, being attentive to their morale. One of the things we talked about there was that's a school that has a long school day. They go 9 to 4. They go till mid-July. They have a longer school year, right? Some concern about burnout there, not just for the teachers but for the kids, because people are working hard and long. And so that was one of the things we talked about is how do you sustain it? Also, high teacher turnover there. And I think some of that is related to the age of the teachers. If you get too many people in their mid-20s, well, mid-20s is a time when people are less stable in their lives, right? So you need some maybe people in their 30s who might be ready to establish some roots. So I think that sustaining it is a challenge. And I think it's a challenge in many places because so many ingredients need to be there together. The strong leadership, the camaraderie of the teachers, and it's easy for that to lose one of those factors and lose it.
The second, and as you're about to answer, Wendy, I just wanted to let you all know that the second group of questions that came from this audience has to do with assessment. So I'm going to give you a chance to answer that, and then I want both of you to answer these questions, if you would, before we go back into facilitated discussion. What types of assessment exists for large numbers of people aside from standardized testing? What is an appropriate assessment? What types of assessment exist for determining the starting point of individual students and determine at what point they are failing to begin with before progress can be made? And then I think this says a lot. What is meant by consequences of success and how do they differ from high-stakes testing? Is consequences synonymous with the threat, So first, Wendy, if you want to address where you've seen this great models of achievement, and then if you both could speak to the assessment questions.
I think sustaining achievement does not only take place inside of the school, though the environment that Pedro and I talked about, it's important that that environment be in place. But part of the tension in that environment comes from the expectation that sits outside of the community. It also is manifested in the types of policies that the school board engages in. It also has to do with union contracts, that if union contracts continue to distribute teachers based upon how long you've been in the system, then you could build communities of practice, and those communities of practice get broken up every year because of the rotation that is required by the union contract. So one of the things that people need to know in this relationship that we're forming, learning relationship that we're forming in schools, is that that relationship can be continued and not interrupted because of some outside force that they have no control over. So the sets of policies that govern that relationship are not just school-based. They're based in the policies of the district. They're based in the union contracts. They're based in the set of expectations that the school board has and how they are exercised. They're based in the change of leadership that may or may not take place at the district level when the superintendent goes, and how do you decide you're going to recruit? Are you going to recruit for somebody who's going to come in and do the reform du jour, or are you going to recruit for somebody who knows what's been going on in the school and is going to continue to sustain it? So this is a complex things that we're working out to do, but you can't have the kind of change that we know we need to have in schools without having the public be engaged in that and be much more knowledgeable about it. Assessments. They're all different types of assessments. The standards-based reform movement has been very big on multiple assessments, opportunities for children to show through portfolio, opportunities for children to be able to demonstrate their prowess about something other than on a multiple choice test. So people have opportunities to submit artwork. People have opportunities to submit writing samples. People have opportunities to, in fact, complete complex, open-ended questions over a long period of time. They're not trapped into you've got to answer this $64,000 question in 15 minutes, but they're given time to work on the assessment, because what we're trying to find out is what the child knows, not how fast they can know it, but what they know. The other thing that's most important about assessments is that we're clear about what we're testing, because the message that comes to the student from the test is that here's what we're asking you. We're going to give you time, whatever that is, from submitting a portfolio, writing something, having a conversation to demonstrate that you know how to do it, putting on a play to demonstrate that you know how to do it. The thing that we want to know is that you get it and that you have demonstrated complex forms of thinking, creativity, grasp of a topic. Now, that doesn't always have to come through a multiple choice test. The problem with these multiple assessments is that they're expensive. And then we get into the whole problem with the public and with legislators that say, well, how much money should we really spend on this? You know, tests that deal with multiple forms of assessment are hundreds of dollars to administer, as opposed to multiple choice tests that can be administered for $1, $2. So it's a matter of money in the end.
Let me say, I am not, I'm going to start with this because then it's going to sound like I am. I'm not opposed to testing. I'm not opposed to standardized testing. What I question is their use. I think testing that's used for the purpose of ranking people and schools is not particularly helpful. Testing that's used for the purpose of diagnosing the learning needs of a student and then designing a plan of instruction to meet those needs is absolutely helpful. But that's not what we do now. We give a kid a test in the spring, and then when in the fall, when they're with a new teacher, the results come out. We have kids right here in Boston who are in test prep programs in high schools, urgently being pressed, sometimes double periods of test prep to get ready for the MCAS. No one has even done an item-by-item analysis of the test they failed to see what they need to work on. No one has even asked the question, have they taken the courses they need to be able to have a chance to pass the test? You cannot, I do not believe it is possible to pass the MCAS, the math portion at least, if you have not taken algebra and geometry. I don't think you can do it. But guess what? We've got kids taking the MCAS who have failed algebra and geometry. MCAS prep will not do it for those kids. That's like thinking vitamins will cure malnutrition. They need 3 square meals. They need actual sustenance. They need to be taught. We are more focused on ranking people than on using assessments to figure out how to help them. Okay? The most important assessment that a teacher does is the one that he or she should do every day, which is to assign them work and then to analyze that work to assess what they are doing, to let that to figure out whether or not what I'm teaching is actually getting through. Are they reaching the goals that I've set for myself? Are they acquiring the skills and the knowledge? That's the most important assessment that should go on every single day. We should be monitoring the growth of kids every single day. We should be able, when a parent comes in to ask us, how's my son or daughter doing, we should be able to tell them, this is where they're weak, this is what we're working on with them. Right now, it's total guesswork in many schools. In many schools, there's not even an alignment between what kids are taught and what they'll be tested on. How fair could that be? So, assessment, yes. What we're doing now, no.
Okay, you've heard from the experts, and now it's time for you to return to your facilitated discussions to take a look at additional challenges, promising solutions, and breakthroughs. We're talking about concrete ideas that you might yourself try to work on or that you can see are feasible. No world peace solutions here. And you'll have, I'm looking at my timekeeper until, 20. You'll have 10 minutes. And out of this, we want you to come out from each table to have one promising breakthrough, one promising solution that you can share with the larger group. As soon as our speakers get back to the front, it's over. We're back. We are back. Hello. I've gotten some good breakthroughs, promising solutions, some concrete ways of addressing some of the issues that we've raised. But our speakers have asked that they be, that I ask one question I didn't ask, and I'm going to allow them to answer this question, and then I'm going to get on to some of the concrete things that you have offered. What is it that we have not talked about that you feel is very important for this audience to think about with regard to this topic?
Well, you're right. But I think we both did say something. Maybe we didn't say it strongly enough. I think the issue of race in education is a major issue. And I think we've been very clumsy and fearful in acknowledging and dealing with this issue. I've been engaged in forums and with colleagues all over the country talking about student achievement and talking about the achievement gap. And the achievement gap, of course, is about how Hispanic and Black and other minority youngsters, but primarily Hispanic and Black youngsters, are significantly scoring differently from their white counterparts and significantly lower. And then you look at this gap, and it's persisted for quite some time. And we also talk about the standards-based reform movement, the work that we're doing now to help get it right in schools. One of the things I leaned over to Pedro and said, you know, we're in a political kind of problem here because there's nothing that we're talking about that is complicated to do. But the systems that we've built up to do these things have been a system of protection, fiefdoms, for whatever reason, sometimes based upon controls that people want to have in terms of secreting money away, making sure that union contracts say that the teachers who've been around the longest get the chance to choose where they want to teach. But I think we will be ill-served if we don't address the linkage between the performance of children in schools, their neighborhoods, the jobs their parents hold, their life outcomes in terms of health, their outcomes in terms of what they will be able to do for the next generation in their families. It's an issue that we need to grapple with. And it's not an issue that I think goes away. I think it's not easy for us to deal with. I'm a colonial historian, and one of the things that I recognized in doing my work in American colonial history was that slavery was the first economy for this country. And basically that economy didn't change until it moved into Jim Crow, and then it changed with First World War. But if you begin to understand that slavery was the core business of the country, it shaped not only economic policy, but how people thought about themselves, what they thought about truth, what they thought about beauty, what they thought about love, what they thought about competence. It shaped everything. In effect, slavery was the dot-com business for colonial America. And you know how much dot-coms shape our thinking now. All of this is to say that we've got to come at this issue and deal with it, not separate from, but it is now linked into the performance of kids in schools. How is it that, the kids who have the farthest to go are usually children of color, and they have access to the least qualified teachers who are teaching out of field, and teachers who are inexperienced. And we know that about 50% of the achievement gap is due to the fact that teachers of math are teaching English, and teachers of English are teaching math. And lo and behold, the kids aren't learning, so out-of-field teaching. But that pattern seems to be distributed on the basis of race. So we've got to really figure out and have this conversation about it. And we didn't raise it tonight. I think it was deeply embedded in what we said, so I raised it.
And I'm going to speak to that question, too, about race and how it's implicated as well. It is ironic that in a program where race is in the title, right, we're talking about the education of Black and Hispanic youth, that in some ways, it's okay, I think, to talk about the schools. We know who's in the schools, right? And if we can improve the schools, it'll improve the education of Black and Hispanic youth. At the same time, I think it is also necessary to kind of address the issue directly. A colleague of mine, former colleague, John McWhorter, is actually visiting Harvard this week, giving a series of lectures. He wrote a book a few years ago called Losing the Race, Black Sabotage in America. And his argument is that the reason why black students don't do well in school is because black people in America are anti-intellectual. Now, I read his book, and I was angry when I read his book. I was so angry that even though I was here, I wrote back to Berkeley, because I know John, and I asked someone to set up a debate so I could go back and debate him in person. And so we went back there. And the point, I started by making the point, I think it's ironic that you would accuse black America of anti-intellectualism when we have a president, right, who is not ashamed of having been a C student, okay, and who has trouble putting together a sentence, right, and we live in a society where public libraries are being closed in many states without protest, where newspapers are going out of business because people stop reading them. So to single out black America for anti-intellectualism in a country that is increasingly showing lots of signs of anti-intellectualism, to me, raises the question of why. But beyond that, because he uses a lot of anecdotes. He said, well, my black students always turn in their work last, and they don't show up to class, and they don't make the effort, and why is it always them and not the other ones? And I then asked him, I said, well, John, who have you mentored? Right? Who have you helped? Can you give me some names? And he couldn't give me a single one. I think that the question of race hovers over this whole conversation about achievement, about the state of our schools, because the fact is, where the failure is greatest is where the most heaviest concentrations of our children are. It's not to say, and I pointed this out to him, I said, if it was simply, there are a lot of white kids that aren't doing well either, right? But they're not held up under the same kind of microscope. No one questions their genetic makeup, right? And whether or not there might be something hereditary involved when they don't do well, right? But I've been to schools where white kids don't do well, and that's also a pervasive issue. But lingering in the minds of many people, and this goes back to the point Wendy was making about history, is the idea that the reason why kids don't do well is either genetic, it's either cultural, it's something not about schools but about them. Right? And we hear that not just from white people, because John McWhorter is a black man. Okay? I believe if we can't tackle that issue, I often point out, why is it that being poor and black is not an obstacle to learning at high levels? If you live in Barbados, if you live in Trinidad, if you live in Curacao, if you live in Cuba, speaking many languages is not a problem in those countries. What is there about those countries? Well, one of the things that's different about those countries, if you're in Barbados, you don't believe that your only options when you grow up is to either be a rap star or a basketball player. Because you look around at the president and the judges and every other person in society and say, I can be any of those. They live in a society where race is not an obstacle, a psychological obstacle. We live in a society where our kids know full well that if they can slam dunk, they have a better chance of getting a full scholarship and doors opening, special treatment, than if they are a B student who just tries hard. We don't value those kids. That's why we let them go to schools that are so messed up. So the issue of race is right at the heart of this thing. It's right there. It's in our history, but it's in our present as well. It's not as interesting. I'll stop with this. I came here 20 years ago, right, to Boston. I remember when people like me could not go to Fenway. We're told not to go to Fenway because we'd be attacked. Right? I remember when I was nearly attacked simply for driving through Somerville. Okay. I can drive through Somerville now. I can go to Fenway. There are signs of progress. Right? I appreciate not being attacked, I'll tell you. I regard that as progress. But when you look at a city that went through this major civil war over busing, all the turmoil, all the anguish, for what? What did we get? What did we achieve? Neither integration nor good schools. So race is right there. And it's really about, do these kids matter? Do we care enough to help them? Same question I posed to John. Is this really about losing the race or winning it? Are we interested in condemning them or really doing something to change it? And that's the question.
Thank you. Now, we're very respectful of your time, and we're right at 8, our ending point, but I'm hoping I can get your support to continue for about 15 more minutes so we can wrap with your solutions. Is that all right? Okay. We've gotten some great, interesting, concrete solutions for our speakers to respond to. Very practical and things that can happen. For example, and I should say that overall, Most of them concern making a community and better ties between teachers and students and the community itself. So, with that in mind, give students the power to evaluate and listen and encourage feedback both ways. Set up weekly feedback sessions between students and teachers. And I thought that was an interesting one. With regard to the whole teacher training question, expanding the educational school curriculum to include hands-on training and training before the school year and reflections throughout the year. Create incentives in terms of resources and in other ways for principals and higher levels of administration to be involved and responsible for teacher recruitment and retainment. Some practical ways to get teachers and parents together. A lot of solutions with regard to parent and teacher interaction. Have some social events, and through those, open the lines of communication between teachers and outside educators, maybe in after-school programs. At the same time, work with the community to get them to facilitate mentoring, apprenticeships, and tutoring. Open up the schools to parents, empower parents, and hire someone to build a relationship between schools, teachers, and parents. In order for parents to become more involved and empowered, outreach programs must be created and that they must come from places that already exist, that are organizations based in the community. And then a couple of political solutions that are interesting to note. One, get a ballot question. Start taking the pulse of the city with regard to, do these children matter? Are we very serious about this? Question why all students don't have the same resources. And I thought this was most interesting. A whole school walkout, including district teachers, students, and parents, on par with the current janitor strike, working to create a sense of urgency around a shared purpose. You two want us to respond?
Well, lots of potentially good ideas. And I'm not so sure about the ballot measure. I'd hate to see it not come out the way we wanted. But I do think that this generating the sense of urgency, generating the sense of will, commitment, making it so that not just those who are directly affected care, but even those who don't have kids in the schools. And there are lots of signs of that already. There are people here tonight who don't have kids in the Boston Public Schools who care and show they do. So I think building on that is important to changing the dynamic. Schools can't do this by themselves, and we should stop pretending that public schools can solve all these problems without lots of support from the community. So I think a lot of good ideas are there.
I don't know if many of you in this room remember Al Schenker, but they're a group of people who've been engaged in school reform. This is the joke that goes. And they said, we've been working at this for such a long time. So now that you're dead and as close to God as any of us will ever get, maybe you could plead our case. And so we need to transform these schools and make sure that something happens for the kids. So Schenker says, well, which way do you want? Do you want the miraculous way or the extraordinary way? So they said, well, we need a miracle, so we're going to ask for the miraculous. Well, the miraculous way is that, of course, God sends down all of his angels, and they go into the schools and they transform them. So they said, well, if that's the miraculous way, what's the extraordinary way? Extraordinary way is that the people do it themselves. And so this whole notion of public engagement, of people knowing enough about what's going on in their communities and their schools to make sure that they have the kinds of schools that they want, is critically important. There should be no ballot on any voter referendum coming up that people don't know about and that people aren't arguing for. Each year or every 3 years, you have to come back and say, do we want the school board in Boston to be an appointed school board? because ultimately what you're doing is you're holding the mayor accountable for the quality of schools. Well, you need to think about that every time you vote for the mayor. Are the schools the quality that you want them to be? So I think there are tons of good solutions here, but all of these solutions are dependent upon a certain level of vigilance and accountability, not on the part of the adults and the teachers in the schools, but on the part of the public. It's critically important.
I have a follow-up question for Pedro. Given that you say race is at the center of the question here, what do you suggest? No, I mean from a concrete intervention.
Well, I think that I would say a few things. One is that we do need to ask ourselves, right, in African American and Latino communities, what are we doing? Are we taking responsibility to promote and to encourage education? Because, again, since what I said before, schools can't do it alone, we shouldn't expect that without a lot of active engagement at home in the community that we can turn this around. So I would say one part of that is, given what's happening in our schools, what are we doing outside to reinforce? Because although I agree with the big point of McWhorter in his book, I do agree there is a lot of self-sabotage, right? There is a lot of behavior that I see all the time that kids engage in that works completely against their own interest, right? And I believe that very often the adults who are working with them can't tell them in language they understand to straighten up and get it together. And they need someone who loves them, who cares them so much that they're going to kick them in the pants and say, this is not good enough, okay? And that's where community comes in. The other side of it is, it would be a mistake if we did not hold the entire society responsible for what's happening. We live in this country, okay? And if we just see this as a black issue or a Latino issue and not an American issue, there will be no solution. Right? That is, it has to be seen thoroughly as the responsibility of a great nation to produce great schools for all kids. And this, we have to see education as an extension of the civil rights struggle. Right, John Mudd? Because that's what it is. I mean, this is the civil rights issue of the 21st century. Right? Whether or not our kids will have access to the education they need to have the opportunity to improve their lives. And that is not an issue that we can just foist back on the people who need it the most. That's a question for all of us.
Thanks very much. I'm going to ask Marty Wilson-Taylor to come up, but before I do that, I have a couple of points that I need to make. First of all, there are some concrete interventions that were discussed here, and they all came from you, which just goes to prove that civic dialogue is a very powerful tool. The second thing is that this forum is going to be broadcast or online at the WGBH forum, and those of you who have left an email address will be able to be notified when it will be up online. And the third and most important thing is that there are evaluations in each of your packets. We need these evaluations to really have a good sense of what you felt about the forum, what could be improved, and most importantly, there's a question about whether or not, as a participant in this forum, made a change in your thinking, led you in a different direction in terms of action. That's a question we don't want you to just skip over. Please pay careful attention to that. And so, with that, thanks very much, and here's Marty Wilson-Taylor.
This has been absolutely wonderful because of you, because of the expertise that we have. The experts were speaking, and they were profound. So thank you, Wendy and Pedro. And I've also got to say thank you to the staff of the YWCA, led by Deb Dickerson, who brought this all off. Tonight's forum may not have solved any problems, but being here and engaging in discussion about the education of our youth is a critical first step in the right direction. All of us care, you care, I care, and we want to make a difference, and that's why we're here. While this is the last in our free public forum series, the YWCA intends to move forward with our advocacy efforts, convening Boston's community and continuing to keep issues facing women and their families front and center. We look forward to our continued partnership with all of you as we move forward on this difficult but most important journey. Before you leave, I want to let you know that the YWCA is an international women's movement in 90 countries throughout the world and in more than 300 local communities. We work for racial justice in Boston. The World YWCA fights AIDS in Africa. We work for wages, fair wages for women. They stand for human rights in Asia. The individual efforts may be different, but the goal is exactly the same: dignity, equity, and fairness for all women. As vast as the YWCA is, we can't do this work alone. We don't do the work alone, and we can't. We need your support. On your tables, you'll see envelopes, and I will ask you to give what you can to help us continue our work. Every dollar you give makes a difference. $1 makes a difference. Thank you for support, and thank you for coming out tonight and staying the course. Stay tuned. To reach us on our website, please go to www.ywcaboston.org. Thank you so much for coming, and stay tuned.